Hi, my name is Tyler. I'm an indie game developer working on my second game. This is the second episode of my Devlog series about the development of my game, and if you haven't seen the first episode, I recommend that you check that out before watching this one. Welcome to the show. Last time, I put together some of the basics of a prototype for my game, and at the end of the last video, I mentioned that I would be trying to focus on a few key things this time. One of them was the art style, the second one was the theme and setting, and the third one was the perk system. So let's start with the art style. I decided to go with pixel art because I suck at art and this medium lets me hide that fact. And by that, what I actually mean is that I decided to go with pixel art partially because it's what I'm most familiar with, and partially because I think it works for this game. And I'm going to stick with this particular color palette since I've used it previously and I'm pretty into it. And I've decided to keep the player at 16 by 16 pixels so that I have enough to work with to get some detail in there, but it's not an overwhelming amount. And that means that I'll scale the rest of the game at 16 by 16 pixels per tile as well. Otherwise, I'm not enforcing any strict rules. I know that makes me public enemy number 1 on the pixel art community's list, but I'm going to take the chances and commit some pixel art crimes. I'll be going with mostly darker colors for the environment and then some brighter colors for anything that is important and should stand out. So for example, the player or the enemies. And the reason being is the setting. Overall, I'm going for a sort of apocalyptical type of vibe for my setting, which is why I'm choosing the colors I am, and I know it might be really hard to think of what an apocalypse might look like. It's a super fantasy land, it's something that would never happen in real life, and it's probably really hard to imagine. Anyway, I'll hit the rest of this with one really big asterisk, because it could definitely change more as I work on the game more, and I don't want to put myself into a corner if I end up thinking of something better. The game is set during an apocalypse. Fungal monsters have attacked and killed all of the plant life on the planet, except for one remaining flower. And because of the destruction, the planet's ecosystems have been destroyed, and everything is on the brink of absolute collapse, but there's one last hope: the gardener, who you play as in this game. And the gardener is fighting all of these fungal monsters who are trying to kill the last flower. Now with all that heavy stuff out of the way, let's crack open a sprite for another magnificent work of art. Except actually, here's the new player sprite. This is the gardener. They're dressed in an orange hazmat suit with a gas mask since they're fighting fungal monsters, and the spores would be harmful to breathe in. It might be really difficult to think about what wearing a mask would be like. I know it might seem alienating to the player, but just trust me on this. They even have an idle animation and a walking animation. I also spent some time creating a tile set for the game, both the wall and the floor tiles. I decided to go with this blue sort of palette to keep things muted and a little bit darker. I'm imagining everything taking place in some sort of like abandoned laboratory or bunker or something. So having the floor be literal tiles made sense. And I added some distress patterns to make it look like the tiles have been cracked and broken up from being damaged and disrepaired and all of that. The walls have a sort of futuristic look based on the lab sort of setting, and I created a large enough tile set that I can cover any placement of the walls. I also made them in such a way that gives the whole game that sort of top-down, but also kind of from the front perspective that you'd expect from a 2D top-down shooter, which I know makes me public enemy number 1 of every artist in the world, but we're just gonna roll with it. Now before jumping into the perk system, I had a bunch of other things I wanted to procrastinate with, and by that I mean make tons of progress on after finishing all of those art assets. So let's start with the placeholder game over screen. As far as functionality goes, the game over screen is pretty simple. If the player or the defend point, which we should really call the flower, so let's start referring to it that way, loses all of their health, the game over screen pops up, and then that allows them to restart. That'll get fleshed out more later, but for now this works for this point in development. After that, I made some adjustments to the ammo system, namely adding ammo to the game, and I went back and forth on whether to add limited ammo or just keep it unlimited. but ultimately I decided that having ammo be limited helps create some pressure on the player and prevents them from just sort of taking the spray and pray approach. And I think it could also make for some interesting situations if the player is getting overwhelmed by enemies and gets low on ammo and has to start strategizing about what they do and make some careful decisions. Of course, with limited ammo comes ways to restore ammo, and I decided on adding a little ammo shop thing where the player could spend some earned currency on additional ammo. This of course meant I had to now add a currency system alongside the perk system, and we'll dive more into how I built out the currency system and perk systems right after the break. So, currency system. I created a small system that does a few things. When enemies die, they drop currency, and right now it's just 1 by default, but that'll change depending on the enemy type later on in development. The system also handles picking up currency by walking near it and then clearing the object once that happens. The player can spend that currency at the ammo shop to get an ammo refill, and obviously that removes some of their currency, and all of those values can be tweaked as needed for game balancing. I then added some UI elements for core values, player health, flower health, ammo, currency, and they all update accordingly whenever they change. These are all placeholder elements for now, and I'll make something a lot nicer in the future, but they're good enough and they make things a little bit more readable while I work on other parts of the game. Now, to finally stop procrastinating, and by that I mean being super productive in other very important areas of my game, and I'm going to switch over to the perk system. I spent a lot of time thinking through this one and trying a bunch of different things. I looked at multiple resources online, tried out different examples from tutorials, I built different versions of this thing, I tried scriptable objects, and the system ended up being something a lot more complicated than I wanted to implement, and it was just more of a hassle than I initially anticipated. So, of course I could make a boolean for each perk and switch it from false to true whenever the player gets that perk, but that would just get really gross and it would make things really difficult to change if I decided to add or remove different perks, so I ended up going in a different direction. Like I mentioned, I tried doing scriptable objects, but just couldn't figure out how to get it working correctly since I needed to adapt it a bit from the tutorials I was looking at. Instead, I opted to go with the system from CodeMonkey. It's a good compromise between doing a ton of booleans and that scriptable object system, and it lets me scale the number of perks and edit things relatively easily while also allowing me to have perks with effects other than just changing a player stat, which seemed to be a weakness of scriptable objects from the different resources that I had looked at. And I'm sure that there's a way to get around that, but I am not that smart, so we're just going to go with the CodeMonkey system. I have a bunch of different perks in mind, some of which would affect the flower or some other object rather than just the player, so having this sort of system with this type of flexibility is really crucial for me to be able to do that easily. For now, I've added one perk, which is a damage boost, so when that perk is active, the player does double damage, and as of right now I have this perk assigned to this UI element just for testing, so it's just a button. You click this button, 5 currency gets spent, and you get the perk, but in the final version of the game, there will be something similar to an ammo shop for the perks. Right now I'm thinking that I'll have basically some sort of like random vending machine of perks. For a certain amount of currency, you get a random perk, but I'm still sort of thinking through it. I think it could be something similar to Binding of Isaac, where you have to take what you can get and sort of figure it out. But let me know in the comments if you think that's a good idea, or if you have some other idea for the perk system that you think could work better. And that's where I'm going to stop for now. Here's what I'm planning on doing for next time. I want to investigate post-processing effects for the game. Considering the setting, I think some post-processing could really help me achieve the look that I'm going for pretty easily. I also want to expand on the perk system and put in that vending machine thing I talked about, or again, if you have some other thoughts, post in the comments and maybe I'll try implementing that. And I really want to make the perk system work how it should during normal gameplay. Finally, I want to work on the enemies a lot more. I want to future-proof the enemies to allow for making multiple types of them, and I want to make some tweaks to the AI and the spawner and wave system. I'm Tyler Haddad. Thank you so much for tuning in. Be sure to subscribe so that you know when the next episode airs. Thank you, and see you next time.